Old Navy veteran is mocked on the subway. Then he reveals a secret letter. Tom Allen had always found comfort in routine. The predictable ebb and flow of life in New York City had come to suit him in his old age. Every morning, without fail, he would rise early, dressed in his favorite worn Navy jacket, a relic from his younger days when he had served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. He wore it not out of nostalgia, but because it was what he knew, what felt like home. The fabric, long since faded, had become like a second skin, its once deep navy blue now dulled by years of sunlight and countless washes. Each fraying stitch, each patch, told a story of its own, of a man who had lived a full life, fought for his country, and survived things that most people would never have to imagine. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. At 83, Tom's life had slowed down considerably. He no longer walked the bustling streets of Manhattan with the same vigor he had in his youth. The city, always moving at a frenetic pace, now felt almost alien to him at times. He had outlived many of his contemporaries, and the ones still around were scattered across the country, lost in the routine of their own lives. As time passed, Tom had become a fixture in his small neighborhood, a silent observer of the modern world he no longer truly understood. People didn't often look twice at him, and that was fine by him. His life, he felt, was a quiet one, punctuated by the occasional interaction, but otherwise unnoticed in the vastness of the city. Tom's routine each day was simple. He woke up at 5 a.m., stretched his stiff muscles, and made his way to the small kitchen of his modest apartment. He had lived in the same building for decades, the familiarity of its peeling wallpaper and squeaky floors offering him a strange sense of comfort. For breakfast, he would brew a pot of coffee, strong and black, and toast a piece of bread, though it was rarely more than half-eaten before he was on his way. After breakfast, he would slowly dress in his old military jacket, even though it was too warm for it most days. It was part of him now, as much a part of his identity as his memories. He would then make his way to the subway station. Tom had been using the subway for years, even before he retired from his part-time job at the corner store. It was a cheap and reliable way to get around, and though the station was often crowded with people coming and going, he had grown used to the familiar faces. There were regular commuters who would give him a brief nod as they passed, but beyond that, no one paid him much attention. That suited him just fine. The anonymity of the subway felt like a cocoon, a place where he could fade into the background without the weight of expectations or interactions. Most days, he barely noticed the world around him. The trains rumbled on, the faces of the passengers blurred into a seamless stream of bodies, and Tom simply existed in this quiet, constant rhythm. His job at the corner shop was equally uneventful. It didn't pay much, but it was enough to cover his basic needs. Tom wasn't a man of material desires. He had seen far too much during the war to place value in things that didn't last. Money, possessions, status, they meant little to him now. What mattered were the simple moments, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee in the morning, the familiar hum of the subway train as it whisked him through the tunnels of the city, and the way the sun hit the worn wooden floors of his apartment in the late afternoon. These were the things that grounded him, that gave his life meaning in its final chapter. But beneath this calm surface, there was a longing that Tom had carried for years. He hadn't spoken much of it, not even to himself. The ache had become a quiet hum in the background of his life, a feeling of disconnection that he couldn't fully place. It wasn't loneliness, exactly. He wasn't yearning for the company of others. He had his small network of friends, some older men who came into the shop for coffee in the mornings, a few neighbors who waved to him as he walked past. It was a peaceful existence, one that he had grown accustomed to. No, it wasn't loneliness that gnawed at him. It was a sense of being forgotten, of no longer mattering in the grand scheme of things. When he was younger, he had mattered. He had been part of something much larger than himself. The war had changed him, yes, but it had also given him a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging to a brotherhood that stretched across the globe. The letters, the medals, the commendations, he had earned them all through his service. He had been praised for his bravery by his commanding officer. Yet, as the years had passed, those accolades had become little more than faded memories. His uniform, once a symbol of honor, had become a relic. Most days, Tom didn't mind the fading of his youth, the disappearance of his former glory. He had made peace with it, or so he told himself. He had accepted that the world moved on, that people like him, older, slower, and often invisible, no longer had a place in the rush of modern life. People today, young and full of ambition, seemed so different from the people he had known in his youth. They wore their busy lives like armor, their faces illuminated by screens, their minds consumed with tasks and to-do lists. He could no longer keep up with the fast-paced rhythm of the world, and that was fine. He had his routine. He had his memories. What more did he need? But there were moments, fleeting moments, when Tom would feel the weight of his own history pressing down on him. He would think about the letter tucked away in the inner pocket of his jacket, the letter from his Navy captain. It had been given to him after a particularly harrowing battle in the Pacific. Tom had saved the lives of several of his fellow sailors at great personal risk. The letter was simple, short, but it had meant everything to him at the time. His captain's words had been a recognition of what he had done, and it had filled him with a sense of pride that he had never experienced before. To be praised by a man who had seen countless battles, who had fought alongside some of the bravest men in history, was an honor beyond words. Yet, as the years had passed, Tom found it harder to take that pride out and examine it. The letter was still there, crumpled and yellowed with age, tucked inside his jacket. But he didn't look at it often anymore. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, he would pull it out, read it once more, and feel the rush of memories flood back. The camaraderie of the war, the shared victories and losses, the bonds formed in the heat of battle, they had all been so important, so full of purpose. But in this new world, these memories often seemed out of place, relics from a bygone era that no one seemed to care about anymore. The city, with its noise and hustle, seemed to mock him in some ways. The young men and women rushing about, so preoccupied with their lives, barely even noticed the elderly veterans like him who had once given so much. Tom was no longer the young, strong sailor who had earned his captain's praise. Now, he was just another old man, trying to make his way through the city without drawing attention to himself. And that was how it had been for years. It wasn't ideal, but it was comfortable. He had made peace with it. At least that was what he told himself. And yet, there was that quiet yearning, a yearning that, despite the passage of time, still tugged at his heart. Perhaps it wasn't so much the recognition he wanted anymore, but the validation that his life had meant something, that he had mattered in some way, that the choices he had made, the sacrifices he had endured, had not been in vain. But the world had moved on, and Tom had learned to accept it. There were days when he felt completely at ease in his solitude, and others when he felt a profound emptiness, a feeling that his life, in some way, was still unfinished. Perhaps he would never know what it was that was missing, but it was there, like an invisible wound, a scar that time had failed to heal. It was an ordinary morning, one that Tom had witnessed countless times before. The early spring air was crisp but not cold, and as Tom shuffled into the subway station, he could feel the familiar rush of the city around him. The sidewalks were busy with commuters hurrying to work, their hurried footsteps mixing with the rumble of passing buses and the occasional honking of a car horn. The subway entrance, tucked under the shadow of a towering apartment building, was as chaotic as ever. People were rushing to and fro, a tide of faces and bodies moving in a synchronized rhythm, each person preoccupied with their own destination, their own agenda.
Tom didn't mind.
The noise, the crowd, it was all part of his life now. The subway was his world, as much as his apartment or the corner shop where he worked. It was where he spent the better part of his mornings, heading into the city for the few hours of work he still managed to do. He didn't have much to get up for these days, but that small job at the local shop provided him with just enough to live on. It didn't require much, and it gave him something to do, some small sense of purpose to fill the long hours of solitude. The city, for all its chaos and speed, had become a comfortable place for him, its noise a distant hum that had become a part of his own rhythm. He didn't ask for more than what was necessary. As Tom descended the stairs to the platform, his thoughts drifted to the day ahead, as they always did. A quiet morning, a few hours at the shop, perhaps a coffee on the way home. The same thing every day. He hadn't minded the repetition. In fact, it provided him with a sense of stability that he craved. A man who had seen what he had in his life learned to appreciate the simple things: the sound of his feet on the pavement, the taste of a warm cup of coffee, the quiet of his apartment when he returned at night. And, of course, the rhythmic pulse of the subway. It was an ordinary day, and that was fine. Yet there was, as always, the nagging feeling that something was missing, a feeling that had become all too familiar to Tom over the past several years. It wasn't that he was unhappy, necessarily, but there was an undercurrent of longing. A quiet desire, almost like a thirst he couldn't quite quench. He wasn't sure what it was exactly. Maybe it was the feeling that his life, in the grand scheme of things, had become insignificant. That in the eyes of the younger generation, those who occupied the fast-moving city around him, he was nothing more than a relic of the past, a forgotten soldier whose service had been long overshadowed by newer battles, newer heroes. Tom shook off the thought, just as he had done countless times before. He didn't want to dwell on it. He had made peace with his place in the world, even if that place often felt like an afterthought. He had his routine, and that was enough. He adjusted the straps of his old, worn military jacket and stepped onto the train as it pulled up to the platform. It was a crowded one as usual, but there was always room for him. The regulars on the morning subway didn't pay him much attention. He had become part of the background, a fixture, an old man in a faded navy jacket riding the train to wherever he was going. Tom stood in the aisle, leaning against a pole, watching the crowd around him. The train began its journey, rattle and hum filling the air as it made its way through the dark tunnels beneath the city. Faces came and went, some occupied with their phones, others lost in thought. Tom let his gaze wander, not really focusing on anyone in particular, just taking in the familiar scene. He had seen this exact setup hundreds of times before. The same people, the same rush to get from one place to another. It was like watching a performance that had no end. A scene so familiar that it could be both comforting and numbing. But today was different. Today, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something small but significant, was about to happen. It wasn't the kind of intuition that came with a sense of dread or unease, but a quiet sense of anticipation, like a shift in the air just before a storm. He couldn't quite place it, but there was something about this morning that felt off. It wasn't long before the cause of the shift revealed itself. A group of young men, likely in their early 20s, boarded the subway car at the next stop. They were loud and boisterous, talking over one another in a language that Tom didn't fully understand, colloquialisms, slang, and references to things he had no context for. They wore the latest trends, designer jackets, slick hair, and headphones draped around their necks. Their conversation was filled with snickers and bursts of laughter, a carefree energy that Tom found both amusing and, at times, a bit grating. At first, Tom paid them little attention, absorbed in his own thoughts. But then, as they settled into their seats near the middle of the car, Tom felt the shift in the atmosphere. The young men, who had been animated and loud, suddenly quieted. Tom glanced over to see what had caused the change. And then he realized they were looking at him. Not in the way one might glance at an older man with a respectful nod, but with a kind of bemused curiosity. He could feel their eyes on him, the way they shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they exchanged quiet whispers, their expressions not entirely mocking but certainly dismissive. Tom had been a soldier once, a proud sailor who had fought in World War II, a man whose bravery had been acknowledged by his commanding officer, a letter of commendation pressed into his hands after a fierce battle in the Pacific. But the world that had once honored men like him had moved on. The young men on the train didn't know, nor did they care, about the life he had led, the sacrifices he had made. To them, He was nothing more than an old man in a shabby uniform, a relic, a curiosity, something to be looked at but never truly seen. Tom tried to ignore the discomfort creeping in, but it was impossible. The quiet whispers grew louder, and he could hear snippets of their conversation. "What's with the jacket?" one of them asked, a thin smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. "Is he playing dress-up or something?" Tom's chest tightened at the words, but he said nothing. He had heard it all before. In some ways, it didn't even sting as much anymore. But it did make him wonder, what did it mean now to wear this jacket? Was it just a piece of fabric, a memory of a time gone by? Or did it still carry weight? Even now, all these years later? The young men didn't stop there. They continued their mocking, their laughter bubbling up louder with each passing moment. "What's he going to do next? Tell us war stories?" One of them sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Another one piped in, "Bet he doesn't even remember half of it." Tom's hands, hidden in the pockets of his jacket, tightened into fists. He could feel his heart rate rise, but he was determined not to show it. He had been through much worse than this, far worse, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. He had lived through battles, through moments when life and death were separated by mere inches, but now, here in this subway car, he felt as though his entire life, his service, his sacrifice, was being reduced to nothing more than a joke. And then a strange thing happened. Despite the anger bubbling up inside him, Tom found himself not reacting with the bitterness he might have expected. Instead, there was something else rising within him, a quiet, steady resolve. He had carried the weight of his memories for so long, kept them hidden from the world. Maybe it was time to let them out, to let someone, anyone, know that he had lived, that he had been part of something bigger than himself. For the first time in years, he reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the edge of the letter that had remained folded and crumpled in the fabric for so long. The letter from his Navy captain. The letter that had once filled him with pride, that had been a reminder of what he had done when he was young, brave, strong, fearless. Tom's fingers tightened around the worn paper. It was time. Maybe not for them, but for him. He wasn't going to let this moment go by without saying something. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the group of young men. The subway car was not a place Tom had ever considered as one for confrontation. For the last few decades, it had been a quiet, anonymous space, one in which the rhythm of the ride had become as familiar to him as the walls of his own apartment. He had learned the ebb and flow of the train system, the crowds at rush hour, the rhythm of the doors opening and closing at each stop, the moments when passengers rushed in and out, their hurried faces briefly reflected in the windows. It was a routine that suited him. No one expected anything of him, and he expected nothing of them. But today was different. The young men's mocking had pierced that cocoon of routine and comfort, pulling him into an unfamiliar place. They had reduced his very identity, his past, to a punchline. It wasn't the first time Tom had felt the sting of mockery, nor the first time he had been made to feel irrelevant by the world around him. But something about the way they laughed, the way they dismissed him, had riled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was as though they were not just mocking an old man on the subway, but the very notion of history, of the sacrifices made by people like him, by men who had fought in a war that had shaped the world, a war that many of them likely knew little about or had only heard of in passing. In the quiet space between the jarring stops and the rattle of the train, Tom found himself staring down at the worn letter in his hands. He had barely noticed taking it out. His fingers were trembling slightly, but he couldn't bring himself to care. The paper was aged and yellowed, the ink faded in places. It had been years since he had read it, the letter from his Navy captain that had been given to him after his heroic actions in the Pacific. It had been a small thing in the grand scheme of war, but to Tom, it had meant everything. The words of praise from someone who had seen the worst of humanity and yet still found it in him to recognize bravery. That letter had been the last reminder of who he had once been. The train's shrill whistle jolted Tom from his thoughts, and he looked up at the group of young men, who had gone quiet for a moment, their eyes lingering on him. They were still snickering, though now there was a layer of discomfort in their gaze, as if they were uncertain about how to proceed. Tom was no longer invisible to them. He could feel their attention on him, not the curious glances they had given him before, but something deeper, something that acknowledged his presence in a way that made his skin prickle with the faintest tinge of both anger and something else, vulnerability. It was a strange thing for Tom to feel. Vulnerable. He had long since put away that part of himself, buried beneath layers of old age, faded memories, and the comfortable anonymity of city life. But here, in the subway car, surrounded by strangers who had reduced him to a joke, that vulnerability had resurfaced. He wanted to withdraw, to fade back into the background where he belonged. But the part of him that had once faced death head-on, the part of him that had been celebrated for his bravery, refused to let him. It was then that Tom knew something had to change. This wasn't just about these young men on the subway, not really. It was about him. About whether he would let the past continue to wither and fade into the forgotten corners of his life, or whether he would step forward and say, "This is who I am. This is what I've done." The decision wasn't as simple as just confronting a few disrespectful young men. It was a moment that had been building for years, a quiet, insistent voice telling him that the time had come to reveal the life he had led, the sacrifices he had made, the service he had given. It was about reclaiming his own story. He felt the familiar weight of the letter in his hands, the small square of crinkled paper that had been pressed into his hands over 40 years ago. Tom could almost hear the voice of his captain echoing in his mind. "For gallantry beyond the call of duty, Tom Allen, you've shown bravery that has saved the lives of your fellow men. Your courage will not be forgotten." He hadn't thought about it in years. But now, the words burned in his chest, a fire he hadn't known he still carried. The past wasn't gone. It was alive in him, still pulsing with meaning. Tom cleared his throat and straightened up. He felt the weight of the eyes on him, the young men who had been so quick to mock him, and the other passengers in the car who were beginning to notice the growing tension. His hands, though aged and shaking, held the letter firmly. The usual fear of rejection, the fear of making a scene in public, slipped away. This wasn't about pride. This wasn't about needing their approval. This was about standing tall in the face of what had been dismissed, about offering a story that needed to be heard. "Gentlemen," Tom's voice was rough from disuse, but it still held authority, a sharpness that cut through the hum of the train. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, the subtle shift in the energy of the car. Some looked away, embarrassed, unsure of whether to intervene. Others leaned in, curious, sensing that something was about to unfold. The young men, caught off guard by Tom's words, shifted in their seats. The leader of the group, a tall young man with a stylish jacket and dark sunglasses perched on top of his head, shot Tom a confused look. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before replying, a sneer still tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, what's up, old man?" Tom didn't flinch. He had faced far worse in his life. With a steady hand, he unfolded the letter and held it up for the group to see. The yellowed paper crackled in the silence of the train car, the smell of aged ink rising in the air. "This," Tom began, his voice a little louder now, "was given to me by my commanding officer in the Navy during World War II. I earned it. I wasn't playing dress-up." His eyes locked with the young man's, daring him to dismiss this moment. "I saved lives. I fought battles that most people will never even understand, let alone have to face. This jacket, this letter, they're not just pieces of cloth or paper. They represent something real." The young men were quiet now, the teasing smiles gone from their faces. The leader of the group shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his friends, clearly unsure of how to react. For a long moment, no one spoke. The subway car hummed with the sound of the train, and the noise from the stations above seemed far away, muffled by the sheer weight of Tom's words. One of the other young men, shorter with shaggy hair, leaned forward, his eyes wide. You were in the war?" he asked a little more humbly now. His voice lacked the mockery it had held earlier, replaced by an almost tentative curiosity. Tom nodded, a faint flicker of a smile on his lips. "I was. I fought in the Pacific. I was there when my ship was hit. I did what needed to be done." What anyone would have done in my place. His voice trailed off as he looked at the letter in his hands, as though seeing it for the first time in years. The weight of those memories came rushing back. You didn't have to, the young man said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. You didn't have to do that. No, Tom replied softly. I didn't have to, but I did. And I'm not ashamed of it. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The years of silence, the years of quietly accepting the world's dismissal of him, began to unravel in the light of this unexpected moment. I wasn't looking for praise or recognition, but I've lived my life knowing what I did. And for a long time, that was enough. For a brief moment, the train car was still. Even the bustling, impatient energy of the city outside seemed far away. The group of young men sat quietly, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by an unfamiliar respect. Tom stood in front of them, the letter still in his hand, and for the first time in years, he felt seen. Not for the faded jacket or the years that had crept up on him, but for the person he had been, the person he still was. The leader of the group cleared his throat. We didn't know, he said, his voice more sincere now. I guess he trailed off, glancing at his friends, who were nodding in acknowledgement, their earlier smugness replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. Tom smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of release, of quiet understanding. It's okay, he said, his voice soft now, a weight lifting from his chest. You didn't know, but now you do. He stepped back, leaning against the pole once more, his gaze drifting out the window as the train approached the next station. The moment had passed, but the air between them had changed. And as the train slowed to a stop and the doors opened, Tom realized something. He didn't need to be remembered by everyone. Not anymore. The world might have forgotten him, but he hadn't forgotten himself. And that, in the end, was enough. As the subway car hurtled through the dark tunnels, the train's steady rhythm felt both comforting and oddly disconnected from the gravity of the moment that had just unfolded. Tom Allen stood there, holding the letter in his hands, still feeling the slight tremble in his fingers as the weight of his words hung in the air. It was a strange sensation, the sense of having done something important and yet feeling oddly untouched by it. The young men, who had once been so full of mockery and laughter, now sat in quiet reflection, their faces drawn with something resembling guilt. They seemed unsure of how to move forward, perhaps even embarrassed by their earlier behavior, but Tom didn't need their validation anymore. He had done what he needed to do. The subway continued its journey through the underground maze of New York, the noise and bustle of the city above utterly cut off from the small, private world inside the train car. Tom leaned against the pole, his back a little straighter than usual, a faint sense of pride settling in. His chest didn't feel quite as heavy as it had when he first boarded the train that morning. It was a small thing, this interaction, perhaps even inconsequential in the grand scheme of the world. Yet it had shifted something inside him. Something profound. For the first time in a long time, Tom had spoken his truth, and the weight of years of unacknowledged history seemed to lighten. Still, there was a part of him that couldn't help but wonder. Had it worked? Had his words landed? The young men were no longer laughing, but did they truly understand what he had shared with them? Or were they simply silent out of politeness, too uncomfortable to say anything? Tom's mind circled around the question, even as the train rattled along the tracks. He had always been a man of action, a man who preferred to speak with his hands, his body, his deeds. Words had never come easy to him, especially not in situations like this one, where the stakes felt high, even though they were small in the grand scheme of things. But the truth was, Tom didn't need grand gestures or applause. He had never needed anyone's approval, not in the way they might have expected. He had lived his life on his terms, and perhaps that was what mattered most. The train slowed as it approached the next station, and Tom felt a wave of restlessness creep up his spine. The moment was slipping away. He could feel it, a quiet urgency settling into his bones. He had said his piece, yes, but something still lingered in the air. It was as though the resolution was incomplete, still hanging between them like a fragile thread. He needed to know if they understood. He needed to hear it. He needed them to see what he had shown them, to recognize that he wasn't just some forgotten old man in a worn jacket, but a person who had lived, who had done something that mattered. The young men, who had been sitting in silence, now exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado replaced by a sense of uncertainty. Tom felt the shift in the air, a delicate change that he had experienced many times in his life, when words became heavy and silence spoke louder than anything else. The leader of the group, the one with the dark sunglasses and the arrogant smirk, finally broke the silence, his voice low but sincere. I didn't know," he said, his words hanging in the air. His voice lacked the dismissive tone it had carried earlier, replaced by a raw honesty that was almost disarming. "I didn't know what you'd been through, man. I thought it was just some old story, like the stuff you hear in history class. You don't think it's real, but you're saying it was real. And I don't know. I never really thought about it like that." The words stung, not because they were unkind, but because they reminded Tom of something he had known deep down. People had a tendency to forget. He wasn't just talking about the young men in the subway car, he was talking about the world at large. It wasn't just their ignorance about him, about his service. It was a larger trend, a slow, creeping erosion of the past, as if the world wanted to move forward so quickly that it discarded the old stories, the old men, the old soldiers. The world had a way of forgetting. And so, for all the pain of the moment, Tom had to admit that he felt a flicker of relief. They had listened, and in some small way they had understood. "History has a way of getting buried under all the noise," Tom said quietly, his voice hoarse but steady. "We forget it, or we ignore it, or we tell ourselves it doesn't matter. But it does matter. It always matters." The young man nodded, his gaze still locked on Tom, his expression more contemplative now. The others were nodding as well, their earlier jeers replaced by an unfamiliar air of respect. Tom could feel their eyes on him. No longer the curious, mocking looks from before, but something more thoughtful, more measured. It wasn't admiration, exactly, but it was a recognition that hadn't been there before.
And that was enough.
The train's next stop arrived, and the doors hissed open, letting in a gust of fresh air from the streets above. For a moment, no one moved. The group of young men seemed reluctant to leave, as if they weren't quite ready to walk away from this strange exchange. Tom felt a twinge of discomfort at the thought of them leaving, as though the conversation wasn't quite finished, as though there was more to be said, but no one knew how to say it. Finally, the leader stood, a little hesitant, as if unsure whether to leave it all behind or say something more. The others followed suit, standing up and adjusting their backpacks, gathering their things. Tom watched them, his thoughts swirling. Was this really the end of it? Would they just walk away, return to their lives as though nothing had changed? The leader turned back toward Tom, just before the doors closed. There was a pause, a moment of lingering hesitation. Then he spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost as though the weight of Tom's words had hit him more than he had expected. "Hey," he said, "thank you for sharing that with us." He hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "I guess. I never really thought about what you guys went through. I'm sorry for what we said before. I didn't mean to disrespect you." Tom didn't say anything at first. He just nodded slowly, the weight of the words settling in. This wasn't some grand gesture of reconciliation, but it was something. The apology was genuine, as far as it went, and Tom knew it was as much for them as it was for him. It was an acknowledgement that they, too, had learned something in this brief interaction. They hadn't just heard his story. They had felt it in some way. And that, in the end, was what mattered. "Don't worry about it," Tom said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's okay. Just don't forget." He looked each of them in the eye, his gaze firm and sure. "Don't forget what came before. Don't forget what we did for you." The group of young men nodded, their expressions sober now. They filed out of the train, one by one, disappearing into the crowd of commuters waiting at the station. Tom remained where he stood, watching them go, feeling an odd mixture of relief and uncertainty. The moment had passed, and yet it lingered in the air, a quiet understanding between them. For the first time in years, Tom felt like he had shared something that was truly his, something that couldn't be forgotten so easily. As the train doors closed and the car began to move again, Tom leaned back against the pole, the worn letter still in his hands. It felt heavier now, not in a way that was burdensome, but in a way that made him realize how much it had shaped him. The history, the memories, the service, it was all part of who he was, a part he had carried with him all these years, whether the world remembered it or not. The train continued its journey, and Tom closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the subway fill his mind. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He had spoken his truth, and perhaps, just perhaps, it would make a difference in ways he couldn't yet see. Tom Allen stood in the subway car, the letter still clutched in his hands, the words on the yellowed paper still vivid in his mind. His chest, once tight with the burden of years of silence, now felt strangely lighter. The air in the car, which had been thick with tension moments ago, had shifted, settling into something less combative, less awkward. The young men had left, each of them walking away with the weight of his words pressing on them, and the truth of what had just happened hung in the air long after the train doors had closed. Tom's mind was still racing with the fragments of their conversation, their sincere apology, the unspoken acknowledgement of the importance of the past, the quiet sense of respect that had settled into the air between them. For a moment, Tom felt as though he had done it. He had spoken up. He had made himself heard. After years of being ignored, of fading into the background of a world that seemed to have no place for him, he had reasserted himself. He had reminded these young men of something important, something they had long since forgotten or never known in the first place. His heart swelled with a quiet pride. He had gotten through to them. They had listened. But as the train continued its journey through the dark tunnels of the city, a sudden unease began to stir in Tom's chest. The moment of triumph he had been riding on began to fade, and with it came an uncomfortable realization. What had he really achieved? Had he truly done what he set out to do? Or had he simply been seeking a fleeting sense of validation, something to quiet the ghosts that had haunted him for years? Tom's thoughts swirled in the quiet of the subway car, a strange dissonance between the sense of accomplishment he had felt just moments ago and the gnawing feeling that maybe he had wanted something more. Maybe, just maybe, he had been hoping for something greater than a moment of brief acknowledgement from a group of strangers. Had he wanted a connection that went deeper than a few words of apology? A sense of belonging? Something that transcended the confines of this brief, strange encounter? It wasn't the first time Tom had wrestled with such thoughts. His whole life had been a balancing act between wanting recognition and knowing, deep down, that he had never needed it. For years, he had walked through life feeling as though he were invisible, and yet, the moment he had finally made himself known, it felt incomplete. It was a strange feeling for a man who had spent the majority of his life suppressing any desire for validation. Now that he had spoken his truth, had made himself seen in this small, fleeting way, it felt as though something essential was still missing. He looked at the letter again, the paper worn and crinkled from years of being folded and unfolded, tucked away in the deep pockets of his jacket. The words of his Navy captain, written all those years ago, still held their weight. "Your courage will not be forgotten." The sentence echoed in Tom's mind, but it also felt hollow now, as though the words were not enough to fill the emptiness that lingered inside him. The captain had written those words in recognition of his bravery, his actions in the heat of battle. But what had come of it? The recognition had faded with time, replaced by the long, quiet years of anonymity. The letter had once meant everything to him. It had been the anchor that had kept him grounded when the world moved on. But now, in this moment, it felt more like a relic, a reminder of what he had done, but also of what he had never truly gotten from it. In that moment, the old man began to feel the weight of a new question, one that had been forming in the back of his mind for years. Did he need this validation from the world to feel whole? Was this moment, this brief interaction with a group of strangers, enough to fill the gaps that had lingered for so long, the spaces in his life where recognition and connection had been denied? Could he ever find what he truly wanted, what he truly needed, by simply making himself visible again? Or was there something deeper at play, something more elusive that he had failed to confront? The reality was, Tom had never been one to ask for help, never one to seek attention. His generation had been raised on the notion that a man's worth came from his actions, not from the approval of others. You did your duty, and you kept moving forward. There was no room for self-pity, no room for seeking external validation. It wasn't that Tom had never been proud of what he had done. It wasn't that he had never felt the pride of having served his country in the most difficult of circumstances. But what had always eluded him was a sense of peace, a sense that the recognition and respect he had earned had actually been integrated into his life, into who he was. He had spent years in a fog of silence, both from the world and from himself, and now that he had finally spoken his truth, it was as though a flood of doubts had followed, sweeping away the small sense of victory he had felt earlier. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the truth. This encounter, while meaningful, was not going to provide the closure he had hoped for. There was no quick fix, no one moment of catharsis that would wipe away the years of being overlooked, of feeling invisible. He had done what he needed to do. He had spoken up, he had shared his story, but the question remained. What now? What did he truly want from this world? What had he hoped to gain by stepping forward, by finally making himself known after all these years? The train jerked to a stop, and the doors hissed open again, briefly breaking Tom from his reverie. He watched a few more passengers step off the train, but he barely registered their presence. His mind was still occupied with his own thoughts, his own questions. Had he really gotten what he wanted? He had shared his past, made the young men aware of the sacrifice and bravery that had once defined him, but what had changed for him? What had shifted within himself? For the first time in years, Tom realized that the thing he had wanted most, the thing that had been gnawing at him all along, was not recognition, nor was it validation from a group of strangers on the subway. It was something deeper, something he had buried long ago. Connection. He didn't just want to be seen, he wanted to be understood. He didn't just want people to remember the past, he wanted them to grasp the weight of it, to appreciate the complexity of the lives that had been lived before them. He wanted them to understand what it was like to fight, to sacrifice, to lose. He wanted more than an apology or a moment of quiet respect. He wanted an acknowledgement that the things they had fought for, the things that had shaped the world around them, were not just distant memories. They were part of the living, breathing fabric of their lives, something that demanded their attention, their understanding, their gratitude. But as the subway continued its journey through the underground tunnels, Tom realized that the only way to truly get what he wanted, the connection, the understanding, was not to expect it from others, but to first offer it to himself. The quiet sense of disconnection he had carried for so long had not come from a lack of recognition. It had come from his own failure to see himself for who he truly was, to truly understand the depth of his own story. In his quest for validation from others, he had overlooked the most important thing, the need to recognize his own worth, to make peace with his past, and to understand the significance of the life he had led. Tom had never expected grand accolades or public praise. But what he had never fully realized was that the thing he had been missing, the thing he had been seeking all along, was the quiet, internal acceptance that he had indeed mattered, that his sacrifices had not been in vain, and that, no matter how the world had moved on, his story was still important. He glanced at the letter once more, folding it carefully back into his jacket pocket. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. The truth of his story, of his bravery, of his life, was enough. It had always been enough. As the train rumbled toward its next stop, Tom felt a deep sense of quiet understanding settle over him. The world might have forgotten him, but he hadn't forgotten himself. And that was something that no one could ever take away. Tom Allen leaned against the pole of the subway car, staring out at the blurry landscape of tunnels, his mind lost in the heavy thoughts that had begun to churn within him. It had been a long time since he had allowed himself the luxury of introspection, but something about the weight of the moment, the brief but impactful exchange with the young men, had shifted something deep inside him. In that brief instant of connection, He had felt something he had long since buried beneath the years of solitude and silence. For a moment, the years of feeling invisible had seemed to dissolve, and the bitter taste of loneliness that had clung to him for so long had momentarily lifted. But now, as the train continued to rattle along its tracks, Tom could feel the creeping shadow of doubt returning. The small sense of victory that had swelled inside him earlier was beginning to fade, replaced by an uncomfortable realization. He had spoken his truth, yes. He had finally made himself heard after years of being overlooked, and the young men had acknowledged his service, apologized for their initial mockery. He had wanted recognition, and in a way, he had gotten it. But at what cost? The price of that brief moment of visibility was more than Tom had anticipated. His mind raced, and the weight of the truth began to settle heavily on him. What had he really wanted from this encounter? Had it been the apology, the recognition? Or had it been something deeper, something he hadn't fully understood himself until now? For a man like Tom, who had lived most of his life in quiet anonymity, the need to be seen, to be acknowledged, had always been a subtle undercurrent, a yearning that whispered in the back of his mind but never rose to the surface. The letter from his Navy captain, now worn and crinkled from years of being carried around, had been his anchor. It had been enough, at least he had convinced himself it was enough, to keep the ghosts of the past at bay. It was his personal reminder of the bravery he had shown, the sacrifice he had made. It had carried him through many long years, a token of his worth when the world seemed to forget him. But the reality of that moment on the subway, standing there, holding that letter in front of the young men, forcing them to listen, had demanded more than just recognition. It had demanded an emotional toll that Tom had never expected. The problem was, now that he had allowed himself to be seen, he wasn't sure he could go back. He wasn't sure he wanted to. The moment of connection had felt good, but it also felt like something had been torn open, something that had lain dormant for years. There had always been a part of him that had been hidden, even from himself. His pride, his sense of self-worth, those things had been buried under the weight of years of neglect and self-imposed isolation. But when he had spoken up, when he had revealed himself to the young men in the subway car, it had felt as though that part of him had been awakened. The problem was, once something was awakened, it couldn't be returned to slumber so easily. Tom had paid a price for speaking his truth. It wasn't the price of recognition that had come easily enough, in the form of the young men's apology and their quiet respect. No, the price he had paid was much heavier than that. It was the price of self-awareness, of realizing just how much he had neglected his own emotions, his own sense of identity for all these years. By finally confronting the world with the weight of his past, he had inadvertently confronted himself. In the years following his service in World War II, Tom had numbed himself to the complexities of his own life. He had lived on autopilot, driven by the simple need to survive. There had been a time when he had been proud of his service, proud of the man he had become because of it. But as the years wore on, the pride had given way to quiet resignation. The world had moved on, and Tom had been left behind. He had accepted that. He had come to terms with his place in the world. Or so he had thought. Now, standing in the subway car, the letter still in his hands, Tom realized how deeply he had buried his need for recognition. It wasn't just about the young men on the train. It wasn't about their fleeting apology or their sudden respect. It was about the fact that for so long, he had allowed himself to fade into the background, to be invisible. He had allowed himself to become a relic of the past, something the world had outgrown. And even now, with the brief acknowledgement from the young men, he was left with a sense of emptiness. The connection had been too brief, too superficial. It hadn't filled the hole inside him the way he had hoped it would. Tom felt the weight of this realization settle heavily on him. He had expected a moment of catharsis, a kind of emotional release after finally speaking his truth. But what he hadn't anticipated was the intense vulnerability that came with it. When he had shown the young men the letter, when he had shared a part of himself that he had long kept hidden, it had felt like an opening, like a wound being torn open after years of being kept closed. And now that it was open, it couldn't be easily closed again. The scars of the past, the pain of being forgotten, the loneliness of having no one to share his story with. It all came rushing back, sharper than ever. The young men had left the subway car, their words of apology still ringing in Tom's ears. But as the doors closed behind them, Tom was left alone with his thoughts. The moment of connection had passed, but the emotional cost of it lingered. He had wanted recognition, and he had received it. But what he hadn't prepared for was the realization that recognition wasn't the balm he had hoped for. It wasn't the cure for the years of feeling overlooked, for the quiet bitterness that had shaped so much of his life. He had gotten what he thought he wanted, but in the process, he had uncovered a deeper wound that he hadn't known was there. The weight of that wound pressed down on him now, making it hard to breathe. The pride he had once felt in his service, the memories that had been a source of strength for him, now felt like a burden. The letter that had once been his anchor now felt like a relic of a life that no longer existed, a life that had passed him by. He had thought that by sharing his story, by letting someone else see him, he would find some measure of peace. But instead, he had opened a door to a part of himself that had remained hidden for too long. And now that it was open, he wasn't sure how to close it again. Tom closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the pole. The steady hum of the subway filled his ears, but his mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions. He had never been one to seek validation. He had prided himself on being self-sufficient, on not needing anyone's approval. But now, standing here, he felt the weight of his own loneliness more acutely than ever before. He had spent so long burying his need for connection, for recognition, that when it finally came, however fleetingly, he found that it wasn't enough. The truth was, Tom had never truly confronted his own pain. He had never allowed himself to mourn the years that had passed, the moments that had slipped away unnoticed, the people who had come and gone without ever truly seeing him. He had hidden behind his service, behind the letter from his Navy captain, behind the stoic pride of a man who had done his duty. But now, in the silence of the subway car, with the remnants of his fleeting victory still hanging in the air, he realized just how much he had sacrificed to keep that front up. He had given up the chance to truly live, to truly connect with others, in the name of self-preservation. And now, standing here, Tom was forced to confront the truth. Recognition had never been the cure. He had thought it would fill the empty spaces inside him, but it hadn't. And the cost of that realization was heavier than anything he had ever faced. As the train rattled on, Tom understood that the real price of speaking his truth wasn't the discomfort of vulnerability or the fleeting sense of recognition. It was the realization that the world would move on, and so would he. But in that moment, he also understood something else. There was no easy resolution, no quick fix for the years of pain and solitude. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to face it, willing to confront the past, to wrestle with the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. And in doing so, he realized that perhaps, just perhaps, the journey toward healing had only just begun. As the train hummed its way deeper into the city's labyrinth of tunnels, Tom Allen felt an unfamiliar sense of weariness, a weight that had settled onto his shoulders that seemed heavier than the burden of years he had carried. It was as though the world outside the train had shifted, and yet, the surroundings, the flickering lights, the clattering tracks, the steady pulse of the subway car, remained eerily familiar. But inside Tom, something was different. The old man, who had so long been content to exist in the shadows of the world, had confronted the truth of his existence in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had been seen. He had spoken. And in doing so, he had unwittingly unlocked a door to a painful, yet necessary journey. For years, Tom had been drifting, surviving in a world that seemed to move faster than he could follow. The noise of city life, the rush of people, the constant flow of news and media had been a blur to him, a cacophony of voices that he had shut out long ago. There had been a time when he had felt proud of his service, proud of the life he had led in the Navy, proud of the sacrifices he had made. But over time, pride had given way to resignation, to the quiet acceptance that the world had no place for him anymore. As the city moved forward, as history marched on, Tom had found himself left behind. The young men on the subway, with their mocking laughter and their ignorance, had been the perfect example of how little his sacrifices, and those of countless others, mattered in the grand scheme of things. But now, as the train rocketed through the dark, Tom was forced to confront a new reality, one that was far more complicated than anything he had imagined. His confrontation with the young men had awakened something inside him, something he had long kept buried under layers of time and resignation. The letter, worn and crinkled from years of being carried around, now felt like more than just a keepsake from the past. It was a symbol of everything he had lost and everything he had yet to face. He had held it up to the world in an act of defiance, asking for recognition, for respect, for a small moment of acknowledgement for the sacrifices he and his comrades had made. And he had gotten it, in a fleeting and unexpected way. But in the aftermath, Tom was left with the unsettling realization that recognition, no matter how sincere, would never be enough to fill the void inside him. What had he truly wanted from that encounter? What had he hoped to gain by revealing his past to strangers who had no connection to it? And, more importantly, what had he hoped to gain from himself? The applause, the words of thanks, they had felt good, but they hadn't healed the pain that had festered within him for so long. Tom realized, in the quiet after the storm of emotions that had overtaken him, that the real work lay not in receiving recognition from others, but in reconciling with himself. He had wanted validation for his experiences, for his pain, for his sacrifices, but what he needed more than anything was to accept that his life, his service, and his story mattered, even if the world had moved on without him. The reality of this understanding didn't settle comfortably on his chest. Rather, it was like the weight of 100 lifetimes pressing in from all sides. Tom wasn't sure if he was ready for what this new truth meant. He had spent so long trying to ignore the ache of loneliness, the empty spaces where his relationships with others should have been, that he hadn't allowed himself the grace of truly mourning the years that had slipped away. There was a part of him that had always known this truth, deep down, somewhere between the layers of pride and resignation, but he had kept it buried. Now that it was out in the open, it felt almost unbearable. There was no turning back. And the prospect of confronting this pain head-on terrified him. As the train approached a stop, Tom's mind drifted back to the moment he had shared with the young men. They had apologized, yes. They had listened, even if only for a few minutes. But Tom knew that the real change had not come from their acknowledgement of him. It had come from his own willingness to open up, to share the truth of his experience, no matter how uncomfortable it made him. In those few moments, he had forced himself to confront the very things he had avoided for years, the rawness of his memories, the weight of his unspoken grief, and the realization that he had been living in the past for too long. In sharing the letter, he had unlocked a part of himself that had been closed off, a part that had long ago decided it was easier to remain hidden. But the truth had a way of demanding more from him than he was ready to give. The instant he had revealed that letter, he had allowed his vulnerability to be exposed in a way he had never imagined. He had let others see him, not as a veteran, not as a man of pride and duty, but as a human being with emotions, with wounds that had never truly healed. The young men's faces had shown nothing but a mix of regret and confusion, and yet there was a brief flicker of understanding in their eyes. And in that moment, Tom realized that this was what he had wanted all along. Not just recognition, but a connection, a shared understanding, a sense of belonging. But now that he had glimpsed that possibility, now that he had tasted it, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. What if he wasn't prepared to let the world in? What if the pain of connecting with others was greater than the loneliness he had learned to live with for so long? Tom's chest tightened at the thought. The truth was, he had been running from himself for years, keeping his emotions locked behind the shield of his military service and the quiet facade of an old man who had nothing more to offer. But now, with this confrontation, with this acknowledgement of his own humanity, Tom felt as if he had opened a door he could never close again. He had shared his story with the world, and in doing so, he had exposed a part of himself that he had long kept hidden. It was too late to go back. The old Tom, the man who had moved through life in silence, had been irrevocably altered. The question was, what would he do with this new awareness? Could he truly allow himself to open up, to seek out connections with others? Could he embrace the vulnerability that came with being seen, even if it meant facing the pain and loneliness he had avoided for so long? As the train screeched to a halt and the doors opened, Tom stepped off onto the platform, the cool air of the underground station washing over him. He stood for a moment, taking in the noise, the movement, the people rushing past him. The city was alive, a constant tide of faces and stories, and for the first time in a long while, Tom felt as though he could be a part of it. It wasn't that he wanted to be seen or recognized by the world. No, what he had learned that day was that his worth didn't lie in the recognition of strangers. His worth came from within himself, from the understanding that his life had meaning, that his experiences had shaped him into who he was. The world would continue to move forward, with or without him. But now, Tom realized he didn't need the world to acknowledge his existence. He needed to acknowledge it for himself. He didn't need others to define him, to validate his service or his sacrifice. What mattered was that he had lived, that he had faced the darkness, and that he had come out on the other side with a renewed sense of purpose. As he walked toward the exit, Tom's footsteps felt lighter. The weight on his shoulders had lessened, and though the pain of his past was still there, it no longer held the same power over him. He had allowed himself to feel, to grieve, and to accept the reality of his own story. And in doing so, he had found a kind of freedom. Not the freedom of recognition or applause, but the freedom of knowing that he was enough, that his life mattered, and that he had the right to claim his place in the world, even if it was a quiet, solitary one. The sun was setting as Tom made his way back to his small apartment, the city streets bathed in the warm glow of the evening light. He knew that life would continue, with all its messiness and uncertainty, but for the first time in years, he felt at peace with the man he had become. His journey was far from over, but the path ahead no longer seemed as daunting as it once had. He had changed for better or worse. And now, he could move forward, armed with tea. Truth that had always been his to claim. The world may have forgotten him, but in that moment, he had found a way to remember himself.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.